Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Trucking Matters webinar hosted by Reliance Partners. Reliance is the largest independent insurance agency focused solely upon transportation and logistics, working with nearly 9,000 customers. In other words, we love trucking. I'm your host, Tom Albrecht, Chief Revenue Officer of Reliance Partners, and today we are joined by Mark Barler and Daniel Vega of our Safety Impact team. Today's topic: how to survive an FMCSA audit. In addition, later on, the guys are going to update the audience with what they've been hearing around ELP enforcement. ELP, of course, stands for English Language Proficiency. And in fact, today is day one of the ELP regulation when all 50 states are now required to enforce the regulation. It was obviously announced in late April. CVSA announced that it would be an out of service violation on May 1st, that announcement, but today is go live day. So it's a bit of a new world. Guys, welcome to the show and happy ELP day, if you will.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Good to have you guys
Afternoon.
back again. And like we always do, even though we've got some repeat folks in the audience, we always have some new folks. And I like to just take a moment and have you guys introduce yourself, what you were doing before you joined Reliance, because I think your background is both important and impressive, and also what you do at Reliance. So, Daniel, why don't you start us off?
Sounds good. My name is Daniel Vega. I'm Director of Safety at Reliance. Before joining Reliance, I was a state trooper in Arizona for roughly 10 years. I was a roadside inspector. I went through the training to Part 8, Part B, hazmat, motor coach, and did a couple thousand inspections. Then I transitioned over to the insurance industry with Nationwide Insurance, helping the clients out there with their safety scores and driver training. And I think I have about 2 years with Reliance, or a little bit over 2 years. And I worked California, my section's California, Arizona, and Texas. Work a lot of cross-border, do the same thing, do driver training, data queues, mock audits, anything that deals with trucking, we do. So
Yeah, and you're also bilingual.
yes, bilingual.
Absolutely. Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Barler. I am not bilingual. I only speak English. Um, I was a former DOT roadside inspector. I retired after 22 and a half years with the Wisconsin State Patrol as a master inspector. I worked in between the Milwaukee, Chicago on I-94 north-south corridor. Saw about 20,000 trucks bypass my location every day. During my career, I've done over 10,000 roadside inspections. I was an instructor for FMCSA for the Part 8 program, which are the driver CDLs, medical qualifications, and hours of service. I was a hazardous materials program inspector and a car instructor and a cargo tank instructor as well. Very little that I have not been a part of when it comes to DOT roadside inspections, including enforcing ELP regulations when it was out of service from 05 to 15. And then now it's coming back into play today, literally today. So,
Yeah, for sure. And just for our audience, collectively, Mark and Daniel have done over 32,000 commercial truck inspections. So they've got a wealth of knowledge. They've seen what trucking companies, need to improve upon, what they sometimes struggle with chronically. And so today we've got an interesting topic: how to survive a FMCSA audit. Before we get into the materials, I do want to just point out a disclaimer that's on page one. This presentation and webinar are designed for educational purposes only. It is not intended to be used as legal advice. The opinions and views expressed herein are not necessarily those of Reliance Partners and belong solely to the individual contributors. So, of course, we live in a very disclosure-rich world. So I wanted to start us off with that. Gentlemen, why don't you take it from here? I think Mark, Daniel, you're gonna handle the first part of um, the webinar. And also, I forgot to mention, we will take questions And those can be submitted through the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. So don't use the Q&A. Submit those questions or comments through the chat icon. Daniel, take it away.
So we're going to be breaking down the FMCSA audit. We're going to kind of be discussing what an investigator is going to be looking for when he comes and knocks on your door. It's going to be the six factors of an audit. That's what they're going to review and determine how compliant you are. And later on, Mark's going to discuss points and how it affects you. That's the first topic. Second is going to be acute and critical violations. So what's an acute, what's a critical violation as well. Conditional and unsatisfactory rating, how that affects you and how you could get a conditional and unsatisfactory rating. And then the two factors that automatically put a motor carrier into a conditional rating. So those are the most severe, and we'll start discussing those in a bit. So we'll start off with the first factor, which is general FMCSA documentation and filings, which is part 387 and 390. So what is that? So 387 is basically having the required minimum levels of financial responsibility coverage. So when an investigator knocks on your door, most likely they're going to ask for your MCS 90. You have to have a minimum of 750,000, hazmat $1 million. Part 390, you have to maintain all the records of your accident reports. So that's what makes up the general factor, which is the first factor. Then we have driver compliance. So as we see, there's three different parts. 382 is failing to conduct post-accident testing on driver for alcohol. So part 382 is your drug and alcohol section. 383, an example for part 383 is allowing driver with the disqualified license to operate a vehicle. So part 383 deals with licensing. And we're going to pull up a table for 385 that kind of discusses all the violations in a little bit. And then we got part 391, not having a driver qualification file for your driver. You're required to have a driver qualification for each driver. MVR, medical, history, the history of the driver's work experience. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just real quick, I just want to add on that the items in yellow that we are discussing is just one part of there's several different violations that can be in part 387. We're just giving an example of one for each part that is listed for each of the factors.
Okay. So operational compliance, you see that in red. That's really important, and we're going to discuss it later on how it could affect you. But operational compliance, there's two parts to it. It's 392 and 395. 392 is basically all your state and local laws. So if you have drivers that are speeding, getting violations for unsafe driving, that's an example of what falls under 392. And then you have part 395, that's a little bit more important, which is your hours of service section. You got your false logs, your 11-hour, 14-hour violations, 70-hour violations. Those are violations that are really important. Then we move on to the vehicle compliance part. You got your part 393 and 396. What does 393 cover? It's the vehicle factor. So vehicle at a service rate at 34% or higher for inspections in the last 12 months with the minimum of 3 qualifying inspections. So that's why it's important that we do these pre-trips, that we're doing these vehicle maintenance to these vehicles, because if you have a high at a service rate, it's going to affect you in an audit. And then we have part 396, which is failure to correct an at a service defect before vehicle is operated again. So that section deals with your vehicle maintenance and your files and at a service orders as well. Hazardous material is your fifth factor. Not a lot of carriers experience or go through this. They usually pass it because we don't have a lot of hazmat carriers out there. But a couple of sections within the hazardous material compliance section, you got part 397. So deals with explosives. So an example of this would be motor vehicle carrying an explosive material not attended by driver or a qualified person. Part 171, carrier failing to give immediate telephone notification of an incident involving hazmat. You have to report it within 12 hours, but as soon as practical. Part 177, transporting a shipment of hazmat without properly prepared shipping papers. Part 177, as Mark said, this is just one example, but part 177 covers all the shipping paperwork. Part 180, failing to periodically test and inspect cargo tanks. So part 180 deals with all the cargo tank violations. Then we have accident rate. So accident rate per million miles is greater than 1.5. 1.7 for urban carriers. Crashes per million miles traveled in prior 12 months. You must have 2 accidents. So as you see, this is important because it's in red. So it affects you more than the violations that you see that are in yellow.
Okay, so moving on, all of those different factors, everything except for the accident rate have to deal with acute and critical violations that are listed in Appendix B of Part 385. If it is an acute or critical violation that's listed there, then it definitely has an effect on the outcome of your overall safety rating during a rateable review by FMCSA. Now, what is an acute and critical violation? An acute regulations are those identified as such where noncompliance is so severe as to require immediate corrective actions by a motor carrier. And what this means is one violation of an acute violation has an effect on that factor of which it is incorporated into. An example of that would be making fraudulent documents or statements to FMCSA, lying to FMCSA about stuff. That is an acute violation which will automatically have an effect on our overall safety rating. Now, critical regulations are those identified as such where non-compliance relates to management and or operational controls. So in order for a critical regulation for it to affect you, we need a 10% rate of the sample size or more, and it's got to be more than one violation. So it's a pattern of violations. A good example of this is if we have during the audit, when the auditor is looking at hours of service and their sample size is 5, they have to look at 30 days for each person. 5 times 30 is 150 days worth of hours of service they must look at. If they find a violation or 15 different violations for being over 11 hours, within those 150, that's a 10% rate, and it's automatically going to affect us. That's when the critical kicks in. You have to have a 10% violation rate for it to affect us. Less than 10%, we can absorb those. The motor carrier can absorb those. But 10% or more, that's when it starts having that effect. Now, whereas acute violation is 1, critical, you need a 10% violation rate of that same regulation of that sample size. So just so everybody knows, and you can look these up, all acute and critical violations are listed in Appendix B of Part 385. There's a link that's listed here. Take a screenshot of it. You can do a Google search for 49 CFR Part 385. Go there and then go all the way to the bottom of that page. Go to Appendix B. That talks about how the safety ratings are done. And as you scroll down, you will see every regulation that is an acute or critical. And at the end of the regulation that's listed in the field, it says whether it is an acute one or a critical one. So acute means one violation, it will affect us. where critical, we need a 10% violation rate under that one violation for it to affect the motor carrier's safety rating. Now, we have the 6 factors here, right? For each instance of noncompliance with an acute regulation or each pattern of noncompliance, which is that 10%, with a critical regulation during the CR, 1 point will be assessed for that factor. So if we have a 10% violation rate for regulation in part 387, and we have an acute and part 390, when we look down to the bottom, that would be 1 for the critical, 1 for the acute. That's 2 points. When we look down at the bottom of the screen, you see unsatisfactory if the acute and or critical equals 2 or more points. So if we hit 1 acute and 1 critical in factor 1, we're unsatisfactory just for that one factor. Doesn't mean we're unsatisfactory overall for a safety rating. It just means it for that one factor. And on the next screen, we're going to talk about how that will affect you, the overall safety rating. Now, factor 2 talks about 382, 383, and 391. Any acute or critical in there for the individual regulations listed in Appendix B will affect there. Factor 3 operational. This one is really important. 392 is your operation of the motor vehicles. Part 395 is your hours of service. Where every other regulation that's an acute or critical is 1 point, when it comes to Part 395, any acute or critical is automatically 2 points. Automatically. So it's like having 2 violations for 1 for factor 3. And this is where a lot of motor carriers can find themselves in trouble for their overall safety rating. And I'll explain that shortly. Factor 4, parts 393 and 396. When it really comes to part 393, that's going to be your out of service rate of 34% or higher for all qualifying inspections over the previous 12 months. And you have to have a minimum of 3 qualifying inspections. And a qualifying inspection is going to be a level 1 or a level 2. A level 2 is a walk around inspection of the vehicle equipment. A level 1 incorporates a level 2, and then you go underneath the hood of the vehicle, checking the brakes, push rod movement, frame, suspension, whereas everything on a walk around is on the outside of the vehicle that an inspecting officer can see. Factor 4 is that's at out of service rate. 396, that's your vehicle qualification or vehicle maintenance files. Operating while ordered out of service. Factor 5, that's your hazmat. If you're not a hazmat motor carrier, then this should not affect you unless you carried a placardable amount of hazardous materials. So, but our hazmat carriers out there, we have to deal with part 397, 171 through 173, part 177 and 180. That's everything to do with transportation of hazardous materials by highway in the United States. And then factor 6. This is an important one. It's just as important as factor 3 in part 395. All this has to do with is your recordable rate is 1.5 or is greater than 1.5 crashes per million miles over the last 12 months. So in order to figure that out, take your number of crashes for the last year, multiply that by 1,000,000, and then divide that number by the number of miles all of our vehicles have driven in that same time frame of 12 months. If it is above 1.5 crashes per million miles, we're going to get an unsatisfactory automatically with factor 6. Now, those are the individual factors and how points can be assessed when acute and critical violations have been found during an investigation, during an audit. Now, how that affects the motor carrier is if we have 0 unsatisfactory factors and we have two or fewer conditional ratings for factors. That means factor 1 and factor 2, if they're each one has a conditional rating for the individual, we're satisfactory overall. But if we have 0 unsatisfactory and more than 2 conditionals, and that would be 3 or more of the 6 factors, then we're going to be a conditional carrier. Now remember, I'm going to move back one slide. Unsatisfactory means we accumulate 2 points within a factor. A conditional is 1 point, where satisfactory is 0. Now remember when I said part 395 is 2 points for any acute or critical? If we're 2 points, we're automatically unsatisfactory for factor 3. If we have 1 unsatisfactory in any of the 6, we're automatically a conditional carrier on the right. Automatically. Factor 6 is the same way. It shows unsatisfactory if our recordable accident rate is greater than 1.5 crashes per million miles. We're automatically going to be a conditional. Now, let's say we have issues with part 395 and the accident rate. That's 2 unsatisfactories. We're going to be an unsatisfactory motor carrier at that point. And these are going to be proposed ratings that are issued by FMCSA. So in order for us to be a conditional carrier, we have to have 0 unsatisfactory and more than 2 conditionals and 3 of the 6 factors. We have to have an unsatisfactory and 2 or fewer conditionals. But if we have an unsatisfactory and 2 conditionals, then we're going to be unsatisfactory. And if we have 2 unsatisfactories and in the 6 factors, then we're going to be unsatisfactory. I understand it can be confusing when we're talking about this, but rate in each individual factor separately. You can write it down as a conditional or unsatisfactory, and then we move to this chart to see what our overall safety rating is going to be. So factors that automatically lead to that conditional rating is going to be a violation, 1 acute or critical violation for hours of service part 395. And where most motor carriers fail this portion is having false logs, hitting that 10% critical violation rate. So like I said, if the sample size is 5, each individual driver is going to have to review 30 individual logs for each individual driver. 5 drivers, 150. We'd have to find 15 individual days of false logs, a critical false log, which is an hour or more of unaccounted driving time or 50 or more miles of unaccounted driving time. That would lead to a critical violation, which gives us 2 points for part 395. We're conditional. Now, if we have an accident rate at 1.6 per million miles, and we're not an urban carrier, an urban carrier is one that operates within 100 air miles of where they work, then, and we have at least 2 crashes, and they're all within the last 12 months, we're going to be unsatisfactory for part 395, unsatisfactory for an accident rate. We're going to be unsatisfactory overall. And what happens at that point is they're going to give a proposed rating of unsatisfactory, and we're going to have between 45 and 60 days to have to do a corrective action plan and submit it to FMCSA. And if approved, then we can continue operating. The proposed conditional or the proposed unsatisfactory ratings don't get published until 45 days. I believe those are for placardable loads for hazmat carriers and passenger carriers. They get 45 days because those are more important types of operation, where the rest of all other motor carriers get 60 days to do a corrective action plan before that conditional or unsatisfactory rating is published. Once it's published, everybody can see it. An unsatisfactory, once it's published, the company is done. They can't operate any vehicles. If they're caught operating, they ought to get shut down where they're at, and they can't move their vehicles. They can't. So very important to make sure that we don't get put into those positions. Now,
Something to add on that, Mark, I had a company that got an unsatisfactory and they had another DOT and they're like, okay, we'll just move all our units to the other DOT. They got a letter from FMCSA within a week. They said that company is closed as well.
gotcha.
So that begs a question, Daniel. We know that the FMCSA has historically been understaffed. Is that common, or was that more of an exception, even though it feels like it should be uh, happening a little bit more?
Well, we know that FMCSA right now is shorthanded. I mean, 8% of the carriers have a safety rating,
Yep.
but they're looking at those carriers that are involved in a fatal accident that have high CSA scores at your SMS, or if they get a complaint. I mean, I think last year we had that bad accident in Colorado where that driver was he killed somebody and he didn't have a valid license, but they hired him without a valid license, and it took a crash to have an investigation. So we know they're shorthanded, but they're focusing on the carriers they want.
Yep. So real quick, when you look at your screen, this is the list of acute and critical violations, and it lists it by the part number. And then at the end, it says whether it's acute or critical. Here's one that is critical. And it starts, it's not a lot of regulation compared to the overall number that are there. But these are all the regulations that we have to comply with. Otherwise, it will affect our safety rating, right? All other violations that are listed in a review don't affect the safety rating at all. The motor carrier can be fined for it, but it doesn't affect the safety rating. Only acute and critical and the accident rate affect the safety, the overall safety rating of the company. If it's going to be a, what's the name of it? A rateable review. If it's a non-rateable review, you won't get a satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory rating because it's a non-rated review. Now, moving forward, so if your motor carrier is going to be audited next month, what can you do? Contact us. We can help out. We can help out. We can go through and look at your crashes. All crashes that are considered during the review are those that are, let me state it another way. They do not use crashes that are non-preventable. So if the motor carriers are looking at the crashes and they meet an FMCSA recordable crash and they're not, and they are listed in the crash preventability determination program, get on the ball immediately and start doing data queues or contact Daniel or myself, and we can assist you with those. Because that will keep your crash rating down. Non-preventable crashes that are listed as that are not used when determining your crash rate. So that will help out. Your out of service rate, if it's at 34% or higher, you're going to get a 1 point for that critical violation of 393. That 1 point makes you conditional for that factor, not for the overall rating, but for that one factor. Daniel and I, we enforce the regulations for 30 plus years. We know what is out of service and what is not out of service, and officers make mistakes all the time across the country. Just like officers are just like everybody else. Everybody, when they get hired on a new job, they have to go through training, and people do make mistakes. Officers are just the same. And sometimes they make those mistakes, and to do a correction, you have to go through the data queue process. And we can have an out of service designation removed from an inspection report. And if that's the only vehicle equipment out of service on there, then that lowers your out of service rate. And remember, it's only for the last year.
Wow, that's a lot to digest there. And In other words, motor carriers need to stay on their toes. I think the next slide shows your contact information. Can you just share that real quickly in case anyone wants to take a screenshot? There's your phone number and emails. Um, and then I want to remind the audience that in the chat um, icon at the bottom, you can submit questions here. But I've got a couple questions, and some of them may reflect the fact that I haven't been on the front lines like you guys have been. But does the FMCSA ever just pull up and surprise a motor carrier that they're going to do an audit? Or is there always some sort of advance notification that will be in 4 weeks from now or what have you? I mean, it would seem to me that if they discover a motor carrier is a blatant violator, they would want to have as short a period of time as possible. So
I
what
think
happens there?
I think if it's a fatal accident, they're gonna knock on your door right away. If it's a really bad accident that's grabbing the attention from people, they're gonna knock on your door. If it's because of your scores, you usually get a notice a couple weeks in advance saying, "Hey, we're gonna need this information. Upload it." If it's not in person.
Yeah, and then the last way that you're probably going to get an audit is if somebody files a complaint against the motor carrier. You may not note it, and they just give you a call and say, "We're showing up tomorrow," and that has happened. I've been a part of audits. You're generating audits by making contact and didn't even do a formal complaint. I actually called up, I believe either called or emailed the division administrator for my state and said, "Hey, this is what we have for this company. They're falsifying their electronic logs like crazy." And this was fairly new when we were just learning that electronic logs could be falsified. This was in the mid to late 2000s. So they called that division administrator, I believe, called up the division administrator in the other state and say, "Hey, can you go in there and check this out?"
Hmm.
And then another one, I was doing a post-crash inspection on a multiple fatal crash. And a few months later, I got a phone call from the investigator that was there doing an audit because of the post-crash inspection that was done, and it was a multiple fatal crash. So it's very interesting on how your local DOT officers affect CSA or FMCSA and how they do their jobs, and who they go in to audit.
We have a question from a gentleman named Charles. Do you still need to have medical cards and DQ files with changes using the new registry?
Yeah, you still need to have a copy of the medical certificate.
Okay.
The driver doesn't have to carry a copy of it if it is a requirement for the not the now the medical examiners. They gotta send it straight to the DMV. But for those tiers of operation that do not require it, such as intrastate or accepted industries, such as you're working for a government industry, but you still need a Class B CDL to drive around salt trucks. We know what that is in the north. Daniel never seen one in the south. But yeah, you still most salt trucks will need a Class B CDL unless there's a regulation that says that they don't have to. But most states they require that Class B. But you don't need to have a DOT physical for that type of operation. There's a few other types of operations that don't that are in an accepted industry. When it says non-accepted, that and interstate, that is a requirement by FMCSA that it be sent to the DMV. Prior to earlier this month, the driver had to do it. Now it's the medical examiners that have to do it now.
Charles, let us know if that didn't answer everything, because I know you were asking in the context of the new URS, the whole universal registration system, I believe. And so there may be other questions around that. So hopefully the guys answered your question. One of the things that you mentioned here on this page is you could schedule a mock audit. Can you guys give a sense of how long that would take? Like if someone has 15 trucks and another carrier has 75 trucks, how long would it take to do a mock audit, and what is your focus? Is it a day long? Is it a week long? Just give us some insights on the services you would provide during a mock audit.
I mean, I've done it before. Just like it depends how you set them. Depends on the number of units. At 75, it's probably gonna take us a couple weeks because we have to review logs, audit them, driver qualification files, vehicle files. So we're gonna review all that. If it's a smaller account, it might take maybe a week, week and a half. But if it's a larger account, then it's gonna take us weeks.
Do you need to be on site for all of that, or a lot of that can be done electronically? Maybe you go for a day or two and then you continue to examine files thereafter.
We'll go in person and then they could send us the files, or we could bring the files back and then we could review at
So,
home.
and would you literally go through all of the DQ files, for example, or just a sample size like a financial auditor? They don't look at every accounts receivable. They look at a sample size that they think is representative.
No, we would look at a sample size, but like I said, if you have 15 drivers compared to 100 drivers, it's a big difference.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's good.
for me to do an audit, it takes a while because I'm pretty stringent. I don't like to be wrong on stuff. So I look everything up. It takes me a while.
Yeah. I think one of the comments that you guys shared that stood out to me is, again, because the FMCSA doesn't have the staff that they need to, that they really are going to focus on complaints and problematic carriers. So if you think you've gotten away with mediocre scores thus far, you're really kind of playing with danger, because if you're in the world of mediocrity or poor, they're probably going to eventually catch you. Someone's going to complain, or your scores will speak for themselves.
So we have ELP now.
We certainly do. I've kind of resisted going there. I do see someone put something in the Q&A, so let's,
That was me doing a thing to everyone on where the regulation is for the medical card requirement in the driver qualification file.
well, there's actually a question in the Q&A box. And just a reminder to the audience, we can see both, but for some reason, Zoom encourages us to tell people to put them in the chat. But I see this question from Asem. Where or how can I find out which violations result in an out of service and which ones should not lead to an out of service? That's a pretty big question there.
CVSA has that out of service criteria. I mean, you could either buy the book or the actual PDF. It tells you every out of service violation.
And I'm sharing the screen now for CVSA. The website is cvsa.org. It is a copyrighted document, so the only place you can buy it from are those people that are connected to CVSA or CVSA directly, right? So to get there, you just go to the store and you should be able to get the out of service criteria. Don't do the level 6 book. That's for the motor carriers that do level 6 types of transportation. They know exactly what it is. They have all that information. It's very specific to specific types of hazmat.
How often is the book refreshed? Right around April 1st of every year when everything goes live?
April 1st of every year is when everything goes live, except this year when they made an exception after the CVSA workshop and they added the ELP into the out of service.
Okay, okay. Well, speaking of ELP, let's shift gears a little bit. In May, we had our highest attended webinar ever. It was really remarkable. And for those of you who didn't get a chance to listen to that or see the slides, feel free to reach out to us. We will share that. It was in incredible demand. In fact, a public carrier asked me to come and present to their board of directors because someone had forwarded them the slides. So there it was an interesting period for sure. But let's just kind of start. You guys have lots of friends and professional colleagues across the states who continue to do commercial truck inspections. Your ear is to the ground. Daniel, I'll start with you. What are one or two of the more interesting things that you've been hearing? It could be an anecdote or just in terms of enforcement attitudes, any direction you'd like to take us.
Well, I know back in May when we had our webinar, I kind of gave my opinion of where I thought this was going to be enforced quite a bit. But now that the guidance went into effect, we're actually seeing it everywhere. So I spoke with people in Arizona, California, Texas. They're all enforcing it. And today's the first day where they're actually get to put people out of service. But before they were just writing the violation. I work a lot with the cross-border community, and I actually had a couple carriers. One carrier received 3 violations in 2 days in a state in the Midwest, and I had another carrier receive 12 in a month. And it's not just happening in Oklahoma or Arkansas, it's happening all over the place. And before we got on this call, I was talking to Mark. There's actually in Texas, there's a few agencies that do inspections, but crossing the border, you have FMCSA inspectors, and they're the ones that are hammering these violations. So it's not just Texas DOT, it's not just Oklahoma, Arkansas, it's everybody. So I'm curious to see what this next month, how the inspections are going to go. Now out of service.
It's interesting. Let me just add on a little bit to that every violation for non-English speaking driver is a 5-point violation prior to today. With the out of service being attached from today on, it's a 7-point violation for driver fitness. And it does not take a lot of violations for driver fitness to put you into the alert and deep into the alert for driver fitness. So just be aware, and if a driver is put out of service, it's indefinite. There is no time limit on when they can come back to drive again. It's going to be when they can are able to read and speak the English language well enough to respond to official inquiries.
There's a question in from Assem again. Thank you, by the way. How can the driver return to work after being placed out of service? And before I hand that off to you guys, I want to kind of interject a couple of the nuances I think that are behind that question, because certainly the three of us have talked about it. And that is, for example, Officer Bob put Joe out of service, and yet Officer Bob is not going to be around 3 weeks from now after perhaps Bob, or I forgot what the driver name I said there, after the driver goes through maybe a quick ESL course. So who's to judge that the driver now is proficient in English, at least as it relates to the truck driving job? So I'll kind of right there. What do you guys think?
I think it's going to be that new officer that's going to inspect him. I mean, he gets inspected in Arkansas and he gets put out of service, and then 3 weeks later he gets inspected in Nevada. And that officer is going to determine if he does know sufficient English to communicate with him, because we know that inspection, that officer is able to look in the system and be like, hey, well, you got put out of service 3 weeks ago. What are you doing driving?
So that inspector is going to know to focus on the ELP at that moment because he or she will see that previous violation.
Yeah.
They can if they use the system called Query Central, which most officers do because they want to see if that truck and driver's been stopped before and warned or cited previously for violations that they found. Right, especially when it comes to ELP, they're going to start doing that quite a bit, I believe.
Yeah.
And here's something to think about with our drivers. If they get put out of service, we got to send another driver out to get that load. That driver, if they get stopped again and cited for the same thing, they can be cited for operating while ordered out of service. And most states, when you get hit with that citation, your CDL, if convicted, your CDL goes away. You'll be disqualified because of it. It's it hits pretty hard. So
Assem had a follow-up question. Amazon sent us an alert saying that the points for ELP violations have increased from 4 to 6. Is that correct? Mark, I think based upon what you just said, it's actually from 5 to 7. So do you want to just clarify that all the way for this question?
I am going to do a search in my special,
We know that it's an extra 2 points. That
Yeah.
part is not in question.
right. B, was it B2?
And while you're doing that, I want to give a little bit of extra color
4 points. I was wrong. I said it was 5. It is 4 points with an extra 2 points for the out of service.
Okay. All right. Good call out. Thank you for that question that allowed us to clarify for everyone. I also want to kind of interject, at our Trucking Matters event on July 10th in Nashville, we're having a litigation panel, and I've already done some prep work with the 3 different attorneys, including a plaintiff attorney. And one of the things that everyone has been wondering about is what about enforcement? Well, that's where litigation will eventually come in because a motor carrier may be a little bit lax on the rear end enforcement to make sure that the driver's been through an ESL course or received some instruction. But once there's an accident, and a plaintiff attorney gets a hold of that, and there's a case that goes against the trucking industry, and the same would be true of B1 cabotage, B1 drivers violating cabotage, I think we can expect an increased level of litigation with ELP at the forefront of that. Mark, were you going to add something there? I kind of cut you off there just a little bit.
No, I wasn't going to add anything. One thing that I would recommend our drivers that are on here or for the motor carriers is if you think there may be an issue with English language proficiency and the motor carrier feels that the driver is good to go, have the driver record the inspection, start up a video, put it in the pocket, and just record it. That way, if there is a way to data queue this type of violation, we'll have a recording of the driver's voice responding to questions by the officer. That will have a huge effect on whether or not it can be done or not. If we have no recording, I can guarantee you will lose on the data queue if there's nothing that we can provide or that you can provide to show that our driver was speaking well enough to understand and respond to official inquiries.
Mark, I see you responded to a question, and I don't know if the audience saw it, but Tatiana asked, do we need to add some forms regarding ELP in the DQ file? And you responded, no ELP info needed so far. But as we think through in the coming months, and there is a driver, Bob or Mary, and they had to go through an ESL, or there's some record where there was active training to help them become more proficient in English. Do you think it's good to show the record that you helped put them through a class or whatever it may have been, even if it's not required now?
Will it affect the safety rating? One, it won't affect the safety rating at all. Will it affect stuff in court? Of course, it'll affect things in court. Will it affect roadside inspectors and auditors in there? I don't think so because they're taught to be pretty black and white when it comes to, well, is it a violation or isn't a violation? If it is, I'm required to record it and document it.
I would like to touch on some of the things that carriers are doing. Just to, if your drivers need the help, they're going through ESL classes. They're hiring teachers. They're actually recording in audio for the drivers the questions that are on that guidance and the signs and translate it to the language that they speak. So be proactive. Start doing things because I think we're going to see a lot of these violations being written over the next couple months.
Yeah, and I think where that is going to where our drivers will get into trouble because a level 2 is pretty much done the same way by every inspecting officer throughout the United States because it's taught that way. Where our drivers will most likely have an issue is when they start asking questions about hours of service, what we're hauling, where you're headed to, some of the questions that we may not know that that officer is going to ask, specifically when it comes to ELD information, their logs. Why did you use personal conveyance in this instance? Why didn't you certify your log yesterday? Why did you go over the 14-hour mode here? Um, that's where I think drivers are going to have an issue if they have an issue with English language.
Yeah, they can't just have a short three-word answer to some of those more complex things where the officer is asking legitimate questions.
Yeah. And the less a driver speaks, the better off they will be. And use different words. Just don't say yes, yes, yes. That was been my experience when people couldn't speak English. They said the same word over and over and over. So then the officer will ask a question that the answer would obviously be no, and they'd still say yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that's different from our early May webinar, Daniel, you alluded to it. We were all speculating a little bit about the level of enforcement, but not just today, but really the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've been hearing that there will be significant enforcement. There may still be certain parts of the country, as we shared in that webinar, where there's maybe a little bit more lenience, but because you said the FMCSA is really involved in making sure states are they're enforcing this, it's probably going to be a little less latitude than we thought. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, we're seeing enforcement pick up over the last couple of weeks. How do I put this? Inspections at a border or near the border zone are not going to be placed out of service. That's in the guidance. Once you leave that border commercial zone, that's where you're going to start seeing that out of service take place. So,
Mark, you had also shared, and even if enforcement is fairly strong today onward, there's a very critical week in mid-July as well. So even if there's a little bit of leniency to make sure that the 4th of July freight is delivered in time, tell us a little bit about Operation Safe Drive Week, when that is, and how that may be an important week as well.
Yeah. Operation Safe Driver starts on July 13th and goes through July 19th. And they're going to be enforcing reckless driving, careless, or dangerous driving. So they're going to be looking at aggressive driving by commercial motor vehicles, specifically speeding, following too closely, sudden lane changes, things of that nature. And I know in the state of Wisconsin, they give their DOT officers overtime to work extra hours for this program. So that's July 13th through the 19th.
they'll be out in full force and communicating with drivers. So,
A gentleman named Rob has a question. From an HR perspective, do you have any guidance on how to address allegations of discrimination related to the ELP requirement? In other words, is it okay to limit ELP assessments to just those individuals suspected of having a language barrier versus evaluating all drivers for ELP? I'll go back to our earlier disclaimer that today is an informational webinar. It's not legal advice, but I'm sure the guys have a couple of thoughts they can share there. Which you wants to start there first?
I mean, I had a discussion with the carrier about this, and they were telling me what they were going to do, and they were doing it across the board because they didn't want their drivers to be put out of service, so they weren't going to hire drivers if they couldn't pass those questions.
So
On the
they're
guy.
kind of using it as part of their screening process, if
Yeah.
you will.
Yeah. Not only that, but something else I heard from an inspector down here, how they're handling this is they're asking 5 of those questions on the guidance and 5 of those traffic signs. So that's at least the enforcement down here where I'm at, that's how they're doing it.
Mark, have you heard anything different?
I haven't heard anything different. It's going to be, and this is my opinion, most states will probably come out with their own enforcement on these are the questions that you can ask, and be articulate in answering those on the inspection report before they place someone out of service. That's a possibility. I think over time, there's going to be more guidance put out either by CVSA or by FMCSA, for English language proficiency. And the motor carriers that I talk to, and I work a lot with Uzbekistan motor carriers, and they're a little uneasy. And I tell them if there is a possibility of them getting placed out of service, do not give them hazmat loads because that hazmat load is stuck then. And what happens with hazmat is normally it'll get towed, and you're going to have thousands upon thousands of dollars in tow fees and storage fees for that hazardous material because our driver got put out for ELP. So be prepared.
Well, and as we discussed in our previous webinar, insurance plays a role as well, that out of service for ELP violation, your physical damage insurance is not going to cover the towing. And if there's spoilage around a reefer load or what have you, the cargo insurance is not going to cover that as well, since it's an out of service violation. So there's a lot of things to unpack there. I would also say an anecdote from the field, someone I'm connected with and know, formerly of one of the three largest retailers in the United States, um, has said that several shippers are also beginning to put the word out. We had the question about Amazon earlier, which is both a trucking company and a major shipper, but those without private in-house fleets were already saying to motor carriers, they're not going to accept pickups or drop off of deliveries in the coming weeks from drivers they detect are not proficient in English. They don't want to get caught on this as well. And I think um, one of the statistics that had stood out, like in the first week after out of service, or excuse me, ELP was established, the thought was, well, it probably won't have much of an impact because in 2014, there were a little over 100,000 violations, but only 5,000 were put out of service. We now know, based upon feedback that you guys have heard, I've heard, we've all been around, there is a commitment to enforce this stronger than we anticipated. Now, maybe in a same scenario, 100,000 violations would not be written up, but maybe instead of 5,000 being put out of service, maybe it's 50 or 60,000. It's still going to be a somewhat substantial number. And so I think it will be very impactful in the next 2 or 3 quarters.
I had just to add on to that, Tom, I had a company reach out to me, that a big produce company that they haul for reached out to him, said, "Hey, send me your plan that you're gonna start doing with your drivers to make sure they're not put out of service as well." So they actually want a plan in place to make sure that their product's gonna get from point A to point B.
Oh, isn't that interesting? So, well, guys, we're out of time. For the audience, there's Mark and Daniel's contact information. We'd love to help you, whether it's a mock audit with data queues, having a driver event, something you want training emphasized around. These guys are really good at all of those things. And if you want access to that prior webinar and the slides that was 100% about ELP, certainly reach out to any of us. I want to thank everyone for their time today. It's been great. We look forward to hearing from the guys in Nashville on July 10th. We hope a few of you on the call will be joining us as well live, and look for some additional webinars in the second half of this year. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.